The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of inevitability, obscuring the stone walls of Fort Sumter as Major Robert Anderson peered through his spyglass at the Confederate batteries surrounding him. It was April 11th, 1861, and the Major knew that dawn would likely bring the thunder of war to American soil. The fort, an unfinished pentagonal fortress sitting on an artificial island, had become the most watched piece of real estate in a fracturing nation. Anderson, a career soldier from Kentucky with weathered hands and steel-gray eyes, had commanded the fort for months, watching as South Carolina militia built battery after battery around the harbor. His garrison of fewer than 90 men, mostly Irish and German immigrants who had enlisted for steady pay and 3 meals a day, looked to him with a mixture of respect and growing anxiety. They had rationed their supplies down to salt pork and hardtack, and Anderson knew their situation was becoming desperate. Across the harbor, Brigadier General Pierre Gustave de Beauregard, elegant in his Confederate gray uniform, studied the same fort through his own field glasses. The Louisiana Creole, with his carefully waxed mustache and aristocratic bearing, had once been Anderson's student at West Point. Now, as the commander of Confederate forces in Charleston, he found himself in the peculiar position of preparing to fire upon his former instructor. The irony was not lost on either man. Anderson had taught artillery tactics to many of the officers now surrounding him, including Beauregard himself. The bonds of the old Army, forged in the fires of the Mexican War and frontier service, were about to be severed by the deeper divisions that had torn the nation apart. President Abraham Lincoln, tall and gaunt in his office at the Executive Mansion, had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision that would define his presidency. His Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, had counseled compromise, believing that war could still be avoided. But Lincoln, the prairie lawyer who had risen to the highest office in the land, understood that the moment of choice had arrived. He had ordered a relief expedition to Fort Sumter, not to reinforce it with troops, but simply to deliver food and supplies to Anderson's starving garrison. The Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, led by President Jefferson Davis, viewed any attempt to resupply the fort as an act of aggression. Davis, a former United States Senator and Secretary of War, had hoped that the federal government would simply abandon the fort and recognize Southern independence. But Lincoln's relief expedition had forced his hand. As described in historical accounts from Harper's Weekly of that period, the tension in Charleston had reached a fever pitch. Citizens gathered on rooftops and along the waterfront, sensing that history was about to unfold before their eyes. The ladies of Charleston society, dressed in their finest gowns despite the early hour, had turned the bombardment into a social event, packing picnic baskets and setting up chairs on balconies overlooking the harbor. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 12, 1861, the die was cast. Anderson's men stood at their guns, knowing they were outnumbered 10-1. Beauregard's batteries, strategically positioned around the harbor at Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, and other key points, were loaded and ready. The stage was set for the opening act of what would become America's bloodiest conflict. At precisely 4:30 on the morning of April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell arched through the darkness over Charleston Harbor, its fuse tracing a deadly parabola against the pre-dawn sky. The shell, fired from Fort Johnson by Captain George Sholter James, exploded directly over Fort Sumter in a brilliant flash that illuminated the harbor and announced to the world that the American Civil War had begun. Major Anderson, who had been dozing fitfully in his quarters, bolted upright at the sound. Through his window, he could see the flash of cannon fire erupting from batteries all around the harbor. The bombardment he had dreaded for months had finally commenced. Pulling on his blue uniform coat, Anderson rushed to the ramparts where his men were already scrambling to their positions. The Confederate batteries opened in sequence, their guns thundering across the water with methodical precision. From Fort Moultrie, the Iron Battery, and the floating battery moored near Sullivan's Island, a devastating crossfire converged on the pentagonal fortress. The sound was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. Across the South Carolina lowcountry, Captain Abner Doubleday, Anderson's second-in-command and a mathematics professor turned soldier had the honor of firing the first shot in response at 7 o'clock that morning. He aimed a 32-pound cannon at the iron battery and pulled the lanyard. The gun roared, sending its projectile screaming across the harbor toward the Confederate position. The shot fell short, sending up a tremendous splash in the harbor waters, but it marked the Union's entry into what would become a 4-year struggle. Beauregard, watching from his headquarters on Morris Island, felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal anguish as he observed the bombardment. His artillery officers, many of them fellow graduates of West Point, were performing exactly as he had trained them. The Confederate fire was accurate and relentless, with shells falling inside Fort Sumter's walls every few minutes. Inside the fort, Anderson's men worked their cannons with desperate efficiency. The Irish Sergeant Major, John Carmody, moved among the gun crews, shouting encouragement over the din of exploding shells. Private Daniel Huff, a young man from County Cork who had joined the Army to escape poverty, helped load cannonball after cannonball into the heated muzzles of the fort's guns. The bombardment created a spectacle that drew thousands of spectators to Charleston's waterfront. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Charleston Mercury, ladies and gentlemen lined the battery and filled the windows of mansions facing the harbor. They cheered each time a Confederate shell found its mark, treating the bombardment like a grand fireworks display rather than the opening of a national catastrophe. Mary Boykin Chestnut, the sharp-tongued wife of a Confederate aide-de-camp, watched from the roof of her Charleston mansion and later wrote in her diary about the surreal nature of the scene. The city's elite had gathered as if for a garden party, complete with champagne and opera glasses, to witness what they believed would be a brief and glorious demonstration of Southern resolve. As the day wore on, the heat inside Fort Sumter became almost unbearable. The Confederate shells had started fires among the wooden structures within the fort's walls, and smoke filled the casemates where Anderson's men sought shelter. Between their attempts to return fire, the Union garrison had only 48 cannons that could effectively reach the Confederate positions, and their supply of powder and shot was running dangerously low. By evening, Fort Sumter's flagstaff had been shot away twice, each time replaced by brave soldiers who risked Confederate fire to raise the stars and stripes once again. The fort's walls, though damaged, had held against the bombardment, but Anderson knew his position was becoming increasingly hopeless. As darkness fell over Charleston Harbor, the guns on both sides continued their deadly dialogue, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night like distant lightning. The dawn of April 13th, 1861, brought no respite for the beleaguered garrison of Fort Sumter. If anything, the Confederate bombardment had intensified during the night, with Beauregard's batteries maintaining a steady rate of fire that sent shell after shell crashing into the fort's battered walls. Major Anderson, his face streaked with soot and his uniform torn, moved among his exhausted men like a shepherd tending his flock in the midst of a hurricane. The fort had become a hellscape of smoke, flying debris, and a constant crash of exploding shells. The officers' quarters had been reduced to rubble, and fires burned unchecked in several parts of the fortress. Captain Doubleday, his white hair singed from a near miss, worked alongside the enlisted men to keep the Union guns firing, though their ammunition was nearly exhausted and several cannons had been dismounted by direct hits. Private Peter Hart, a young Irishman who had enlisted barely 6 months earlier, found himself manning a cannon with Sergeant Carmody when a Confederate shell exploded just yards from their position. The blast threw both men against the fort's stone wall, leaving Hart with a ringing in his ears that would plague him for the rest of his life. Yet he pulled himself to his feet, wiped the blood from a cut on his forehead, and helped reload the gun for another shot. Across the harbor, General Beauregard watched the bombardment with growing concern. While his batteries were clearly winning the artillery duel, he had expected Anderson to surrender by now. The Union major's stubborn resistance was gaining him admirers even among the Confederate ranks. Beauregard, who remembered Anderson as a thorough and dedicated instructor, was not surprised by his former teacher's tenacity. The Confederate general faced a dilemma that would haunt military commanders throughout the coming war. He could continue the bombardment until Fort Sumter was reduced to rubble, but that would likely result in significant casualties among Anderson's garrison men who were, despite everything, still Americans. Beauregard had already sent to surrender demands to the fort, both of which Anderson had politely but firmly refused. According to historical accounts preserved in the War of the Rebellion, official records, the scene inside Fort Sumter had become desperate by midday on April 13th. The fort's magazine was dangerously close to catching fire, which would have resulted in a massive explosion that could have killed every man in the garrison. Anderson made the agonizing decision to have his men pour water on the remaining powder, supplies, and cease firing their larger guns. Captain Doubleday later wrote in his memoirs that the decision to flood the magazine was perhaps the most difficult moment of the entire siege. The men had fought bravely for over 30 hours, and the idea of essentially surrendering their ability to fight back was almost unbearable. Yet Anderson's wisdom in preventing a catastrophic explosion would ultimately save dozens of lives. As the morning wore on, Confederate fire had reduced much of Fort Sumter's interior to smoking ruins. The barracks were gone, the officers' quarters destroyed, and the flag had been shot down so many times that the garrison had run out of suitable poles to hoist it. Private Huff and several other soldiers had risked their lives repeatedly to keep the stars and stripes flying, using everything from broken fence posts to makeshift flagstaffs constructed from splintered lumber. The heat from the fires had become so intense that Anderson's men were forced to crawl on their hands and knees to move between positions. Several soldiers had already collapsed from smoke inhalation, and the fort's meager supply of fresh water was nearly exhausted. The Confederate shells continued to fall with mechanical precision, each explosion sending shockwaves through the stone walls and showering the defenders with debris. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Anderson realized that continued resistance would serve no purpose other than to get his men killed. The fort could not be held, relief was impossible, and honor had been satisfied. The time had come to make the most difficult decision of his military career, decision that would echo through the pages of American history and mark the true beginning of a war that would consume the nation for long and bloody years. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon of April 13th, 1861, a white bedsheet appeared above the smoke-shrouded walls of Fort Sumter. Private Hart, barely visible through the dense smoke that filled the fort's interior, waved the improvised flag of surrender from what remained of the ramparts. The Confederate batteries, which had been maintaining their relentless bombardment for over 30 hours, gradually fell silent as the gunners recognized the universal symbol of capitulation. Major Anderson, his uniform blackened with soot and his face etched with the weight of command, had made perhaps the most difficult decision of his distinguished military career. With his ammunition nearly exhausted, his men overcome by smoke, and fires raging throughout the fort, continued resistance would serve only to sacrifice lives unnecessarily. The major had consulted with his officers, Captain Doubleday, Captain Truman Seymour, and the others, and they had unanimously agreed that surrender was the only honorable option remaining. General Beauregard, observing the white flag through his field glasses, felt a complex mixture of relief and melancholy. His former instructor had conducted a defense that would be remembered as one of the most gallant in American military history, but the price of that gallantry was evident in the smoking ruins of what had once been a proud fortress. The Confederate general immediately ordered his batteries to cease fire and dispatched 3 of his aides, Colonel James Chestnut Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Colonel Alexander Robert Chisholm, to negotiate the terms of surrender. The Confederate officers rowed across the harbor in a small boat, their oars cutting through water littered with debris from the bombardment. As they approached Fort Sumter's water gate, they could see the extent of the damage their artillery had inflicted. The fort's walls, though still standing, were pockmarked with shell holes, and smoke poured from numerous fires burning within the fortress. The scene resembled something from Dante's vision of hell rather than a military installation. Anderson met the Confederate delegation at the fort's entrance, his demeanor dignified despite his disheveled appearance. The negotiations were conducted with the courtesy that had characterized the entire affair. a reflection of the professional relationships that existed between many of the officers on both sides. Beauregard, through his representatives, offered generous terms that would allow Anderson and his men to depart with full military honors. The surrender terms, as recorded in official military correspondence of the period, were remarkably magnanimous. Anderson's garrison would be permitted to salute their flag, march out with shouldered arms, and depart on a ship bound for New York. The Confederate government, eager to demonstrate that it was conducting itself as a legitimate nation rather than as rebels, wanted to show the world that it could behave with honor and restraint. As word of the surrender spread through Charleston, the city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang throughout the afternoon and evening, and crowds gathered in the streets to cheer the news. The bombardment of Fort Sumter was being hailed as a bloodless victory, a demonstration of Southern resolve that had forced the federal government to acknowledge the reality of secession. Yet not everyone in Charleston celebrated with unrestrained joy. Mary Chestnut, observing the revelry from her mansion window, noted in her diary a sense of foreboding that many of the more thoughtful citizens shared. The firing on Fort Sumter had crossed a line from which there might be no return. What had begun as a political crisis had now become a military conflict, and the consequences of that transformation remained to be seen. Captain Doubleday, helping to organize the evacuation of the fort's wounded and exhausted garrison, found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. He had fired the first Union shot of what was already being called the Civil War, and now he was preparing to march out of Fort Sumter in defeat. Yet there was no shame in the surrender. Anderson and his men had conducted themselves with honor. Against impossible odds, the sun was setting over Charleston Harbor as the final details of the surrender were arranged. Anderson had requested permission to conduct a ceremonial salute to the flag before departing, and Beauregard had graciously agreed. The ceremony would take place the following morning, April 14th, 1861, and would mark the end of the first engagement of America's most tragic conflict. The morning of April 14th, 1861, dawned clear and still over Charleston Harbor, as if nature itself wished to observe the solemn ceremony that would mark the end of the siege of Fort Sumter. Major Anderson, who had spent a sleepless night organizing the evacuation of his command, stood before his assembled garrison in the fort's smoke-stained parade ground. The 85 men who had endured the 34-hour bombardment formed neat ranks despite their exhaustion, their blue uniforms torn and blackened, but their bearing still proud. Anderson had negotiated with General Beauregard for the right to fire a ceremonial salute to the American flag before departing the fort. It was a matter of honor, a final gesture of defiance and respect for the banner under which they had served. The Confederate general, understanding the importance of military tradition, had agreed to allow a 50-gun salute, one round for each state in the Union as it had existed. Before the crisis began, Private Daniel Huff, the young Irishman who had fought so bravely during the bombardment, was assigned to one of the cannons designated for the salute. As the ceremony began, he and his fellow soldiers loaded their guns with powder but no shot, preparing to fire blank charges into the morning air. The irony was not lost on any of them. They were using the same cannons that had just finished fighting the Confederates to honor the flag they were about to lower in defeat. Mary Chestnut, writing in her diary that evening, captured the mood of uncertainty that lurked beneath Charleston's celebration. Today we have made history, but what manner of history remains to be seen? The thunder of our guns has awakened forces that may prove beyond our ability to control. Her words would prove prophetic in ways that even she could not have imagined. Major Anderson and his garrison arrived in New York Harbor on April 17, 1861, to find themselves transformed from defeated soldiers into national heroes. Crowds lined the waterfront, cheering the men who had defended Fort Sumter against overwhelming odds. Newspaper headlines proclaimed Anderson the hero of Fort Sumter, and the flag that had flown over the battered fortress became a sacred relic of the Republic's resistance to rebellion. President Lincoln, faced with the reality of war, issued a proclamation on April 15th calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the North, young men flocked to recruiting stations, eager to serve their country and convinced that the rebellion would be crushed quickly and decisively. Few understood that they were embarking on a conflict that would last for years and cost over 600,000 American lives. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had accomplished what no political speech or newspaper editorial could have achieved. It had united the North behind the Lincoln administration's determination to preserve the Union. The attack on a federal installation, conducted under the flag of a newly declared nation, had transformed what many Northerners saw as a political dispute into a matter of national survival. As documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the siege of Fort Sumter established patterns that would characterize the entire conflict. The Civil War would be fought with a combination of modern technology and traditional tactics, resulting in unprecedented levels of destruction and casualties. The bombardment had also demonstrated the importance of public opinion and political symbolism. In what would become America's first truly modern war, General Beauregard, now in command of Fort Sumter and the Charleston defenses, began preparing for what he expected would be a prolonged conflict. The bloodless victory in Charleston Harbor had been achieved through superior numbers and positioning, but future engagements would not be so one-sided. The Confederate general, like his counterparts in the North, expected a short war decided by a few decisive battles, but he was prepared for whatever might come. Private Hart, recovering from his wounds aboard the Baltic, would carry the ringing in his ears for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of those 34 hours when the fate of a nation hung in the balance. He would re-enlist in the Union Army and serve throughout the war, participating in battles from Bull Run to Appomattox. The siege of Fort Sumter had been his baptism of fire, the moment when he truly understood what it meant to serve under the flag of the United States. The thunder that had echoed across Charleston Harbor on April 12th and 13th, 1861, would reverberate throughout the nation for long and bloody years. Fort Sumter had been surrendered, but the cause for which Anderson and his men had fought, the preservation of the Union, would ultimately triumph. The siege had ended in defeat, but it had also marked the beginning of a struggle that would redefine America and ensure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. In the end, the bombardment of Fort Sumter proved to be not the conclusion of a political crisis, but the opening movement of a national symphony written in smoke and thunder, blood and valor, defeat and ultimate redemption. The echo of those first shots would resonate through American history, reminding future generations of the price of preserving the Union and the courage of those who answered their country's call in its darkest hour.